Welcome to Sci-Fi Facts, where every movie hides a secret. Every scene tells a deeper story. And every frame contains details most viewers never notice, from legendary blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to dark thrillers, unforgettable horror, and hidden cinematic gems. We explore the facts, theories, Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that make movies truly unforgettable. This isn't just watching movies, this is discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Sci-Fi Facts and step beyond the screen. One of the first places he visits is the Empire State Building, a spot tied to cherished memories of his mother, Mary. As his confidence grows, so does his ambition. Curious how far he can push his abilities, David scopes out the inside of a bank during business hours. That night, he teleports straight into the vault and walks off with a fortune. While David is back in his motel room enjoying his sudden wealth, authorities are already investigating the robbery. Among them is a man named Roland, who arrives under the guise of working for national security. Unlike everyone else, Roland already has a theory. He knows about people called jumpers, individuals capable of teleportation, and he's convinced one of them is responsible. 8 years pass. David has turned his stolen fortune into a life of luxury, now living in an extravagant penthouse in New York City and enjoying every benefit his powers can offer. His control has become so precise that he teleports from room to room in his own apartment instead of walking. The walls of his home are covered with photographs of famous locations around the world, each one a gateway to another adventure. One day he might be relaxing atop an ancient monument in Egypt, the next, exploring an entirely different continent. During an evening trip to London, David steps into a crowded pub, feeling confident and carefree. He casually teleports across the room to impress a woman at the bar. He assumes no one notices, but a mysterious man named Griffin catches the whole display. Unaware, David leaves with the woman. Elsewhere, another jumper suddenly appears in the middle of a tropical jungle. Before he can react, he's trapped in a specially designed net woven with electrified cables that continually shock him, preventing him from teleporting away. The trap belongs to Roland and his organization, the Paladins, a group that views jumpers as unnatural beings and has dedicated itself to hunting them down. Without hesitation or mercy, Roland kills the trapped jumper. Moments later, he receives a lead on another target, David. When David returns home, he's stunned to find Roland waiting inside his apartment, surrounded by the countless notes David has left behind in bank vaults over the years, all of which Roland has collected. David orders him to leave, but Roland responds by attacking with a specialized weapon connected to a cable. The baton delivers a powerful shock, overwhelming David and disrupting his ability to teleport properly. A violent struggle breaks out across the penthouse. David keeps trying to escape, but the shocks limit him to short jumps. Eventually, he manages to teleport into a hidden chamber behind one of the walls, severing the cable attached to Roland's weapon and buying himself a brief advantage. Roland traces the cable and starts smashing through the wall to reach him. Realizing he can't stay, David grabs stacks of cash and teleports away before Roland can catch him. Roland refuses to let the trail go cold. After examining the photographs in David's apartment, he sends Paladin teams to many of the locations David frequently visits. While going through David's belongings, he also finds an old photo of Millie, another valuable lead. Meanwhile, David returns to the house where he grew up. Hearing movement downstairs, his father William rushes to investigate. Unlike the angry man David remembers, William now seems broken and confused. He admits that nobody believes him when he talks about David, and tells him he's always welcome to come home. David simply assures him he isn't losing his mind, then disappears again. The next morning, David considers reconnecting with his father properly, but years of pain make it impossible to follow through. Instead, he decides to find Millie. When he arrives at her mother's house, she's stunned to see David alive after all these years. Overcome with emotion, she embraces him and tells him Millie now works at the local bar. David heads there right away, But the moment he catches sight of the adult Millie, his old insecurities resurface, and he tries to slip out before she notices him. Before he can escape, he runs straight into Mark, who instantly recognizes him and loudly demands to know where he's been all this time. The commotion draws Millie's attention. She walks over and reveals she noticed David the second he walked in. In fact, she'd been waiting to see if he'd work up the nerve to speak to her first. Mark doesn't bother hiding his jealousy, and in an attempt to impress Millie, makes an unwanted move toward her right in front of David. That's the last straw. David throws a punch that sends Mark reeling, and the scene instantly turns into a full-blown brawl. Chairs scrape across the floor, people back away, and before long the fight spills out of the bar and onto the street, away from prying eyes. David finally gets an opening. He shoves Mark through a nearby fence and, in the same instant, teleports them both away. Mark barely has time to react before he finds himself standing inside the very bank vault David robbed years earlier, surrounded by stacks of money and completely trapped. David warns him not to push his luck again, hints that things could get much worse, and vanishes, leaving Mark stranded as payback for years of torment. After cooling off, David returns to the bar and sits down with Millie. The conversation turns personal. Millie admits that her old dream of seeing the world slowly faded as real-life bills, work, responsibilities took over. David claims he's in banking these days and, on impulse, invites her to spend a weekend in Rome with him. Millie eagerly agrees. What neither of them realizes is that Griffin is nearby, quietly listening to every word. At the same time, Roland shows up at the local police station pretending to be with the CIA. When officers question his authority, he responds with intimidation rather than patience, eventually gaining access to Mark. Unlike everyone else, Roland openly says he believes Mark's unbelievable story about teleportation. Relieved that someone finally believes him, Mark tells Roland everything he knows about David, including his connection to Millie. It's exactly the information Roland needs, and he immediately sends his men to Italy. A few hours later, David and Millie arrive in Rome and check into an extravagant hotel. The luxury raises questions in Millie's mind. She can't quite believe an ordinary banking job could afford this kind of lifestyle. David insists his story is true, but his explanation does little to ease her doubts. Still, the chemistry between them keeps building, and after some time at the hotel, they head out to explore the city. They wander through Rome's historic streets, soaking in the atmosphere, while Griffin secretly watches them from a distance. As evening falls, they decide to visit the Colosseum, only to find it's already closed for the day. While Millie is distracted, David quietly teleports inside and unlocks a side entrance from within, then pretends he simply found it open and leads her in. Together they wander through the ancient structure, admiring the architecture and imagining the centuries of history within its walls. Whenever they hit a locked passage, David secretly uses his powers to open the way, careful to make it look natural. Eventually he tries to access one of the restricted lower sections beneath the arena and unexpectedly runs into Griffin, who's casually relieving himself against a stone pillar. David tries to pretend he never saw him and keep walking, but Griffin has other plans, teleporting directly in front of him to finally introduce himself. He explains that David isn't unique. There are jumpers all over the world and criticizes him for dragging an ordinary person into danger and using his powers recklessly in public. According to Griffin, David has drawn the attention of enemies he doesn't fully understand. Before the conversation can go further, trouble arrives. Paladins storm the Colosseum and begin their pursuit. David is caught off guard and struck by one of their electrified weapons, leaving him temporarily helpless. Griffin, who's fought these hunters before, vanishes the moment the attack begins, and Paladins start dropping one after another as he teleports around them faster than they can react. After helping David escape the immediate danger, Griffin briefly explains the Paladin threat before disappearing again. Moments later, a Colosseum employee arrives shouting about intruders. Using the lingering distortion Griffin's teleportation left behind, David follows it and stumbles onto Griffin's hidden base deep in the desert. Griffin is furious to find him there and reminds him that Millie is still alone back at the Coliseum, vulnerable. Realizing his mistake, David teleports back immediately to find her, but by the time they reach the exit, the authorities are waiting, and both David and Millie are arrested. 8 hours pass. David sits in an interrogation room while Italian authorities struggle to make sense of the situation. Because he's an American citizen, they have to wait for a representative from the U.S. Embassy before proceeding. To David's shock, that representative turns out to be his mother, Mary. After years without answers, she suddenly appears and quietly removes his handcuffs, urging him to leave before more paladins arrive. David desperately wants an explanation for her disappearance all those years ago, but before he can get one, a police officer steps between them. Annoyed and impatient, David teleports the officer all the way to Egypt and keeps searching for answers, but Mary is already gone. With no better option, David returns to Millie and casually claims the authorities decided to release them. Millie finds the story hard to believe, but David urges her to trust him, and together they head for the airport. During the trip, Millie finally reaches her limit. If everything is supposedly fine, why are they running, and why is David acting so strangely? She demands the truth. Instead of answering directly, David opens his bag and reveals bundles of cash, which only deepens her confusion. Finally, David tells her they can't be together anymore. Without offering a real explanation, he walks away, and heartbroken and feeling deceived, Millie boards a plane home alone. Elsewhere, Roland learns the Rome operation ended in disaster as men were defeated so thoroughly it's almost as if someone knew they were coming. Looking for another lead, Roland visits William, who pretends he hasn't seen his son since the day he vanished and makes clear that even if he did know where David was, he'd never help authorities track him down. Roland doesn't appreciate the answer. Meanwhile, David arrives back at Griffin's desert hideout and this time learns much more about the ongoing conflict. Griffin isn't just hiding from the paladins, he actively hunts them. According to him, the organization has existed for centuries, spending generations persecuting jumpers and playing a role in historical campaigns of fear and persecution, including the witch hunts and the Inquisition. More importantly, Griffin warns David that paladins don't always target jumpers directly when necessary. They go after friends, family, and anyone else connected to them. The realization hits David hard. Millie is still in the air and relatively safe for now, but his father isn't. David instantly teleports back to his childhood home, where the sight waiting for him is devastating. William lies motionless on the floor, overwhelmed with grief and refusing to accept what he sees. David teleports his father straight to a hospital, but there's nothing doctors can do. William is already gone. Consumed by anger, David heads to the police station and confronts Mark, who finally confesses under pressure that he told Roland everything. David's history with Millie, details about their hometown, all of it. David immediately understands the danger. If Roland has that information, Millie could be next. Determined to reach her before her plane lands in the U.S., David returns to Griffin's hideout and tries to take the files containing years of research on the paladins. Griffin stops him, explaining that ordinary paladin agents are one thing, but Roland is something else entirely. Exceptionally dangerous, and going after him without a plan could easily get David killed. David takes the warning seriously but draws a different conclusion. If Roland is truly that dangerous, facing him alone is a terrible idea, and the obvious solution is to team up. Griffin, however, wants no part of a partnership and bluntly says he works alone and intends to keep it that way. He teleports to Tokyo hoping to put distance between them, but David follows, and no matter where Griffin goes, David keeps showing up and pushing the idea of forming a team, and the persistence eventually becomes impossible to ignore. While in Tokyo, Griffin decides to entertain himself by stealing a sports car, but instead of simply driving off, he teleports repeatedly while carrying the vehicle with him. effectively making the car jump from place to place as it races down the road. David is amazed he's never tried teleporting anything that large. During the ride, Griffin shares a cautionary story about another jumper who once tried transporting an entire building in an attempt that cost the man his life. The lesson is clear: even their extraordinary abilities have limits. Eventually, worn down by David's endless requests, Griffin agrees to cooperate, but only on one condition. Once this is over, David never bothers him again. With their temporary alliance in place, the two teleport to the airport hoping to intercept Millie. But they arrive too late. Her flight has already landed and she's gone. Growing worried, David visits the bar where Millie works, and a waitress mentions that another man has been asking about her recently. Roland, realizing the danger, David teleports straight to Millie's apartment and, to his relief, finds her alive and unharmed. The reunion doesn't go smoothly. Millie wants nothing to do with him after everything that's happened and refuses to listen. But David senses trouble closing in and tries desperately to explain himself. To prove he's telling the truth, he teleports around the room and even retrieves the snow globe he gave her as a child. But rather than convincing her, the display terrifies her, and Millie panics and tries to flee. With enemies moments from arriving, David makes a hard call. He grabs her and teleports them both to Griffin's desert hideout. Griffin is furious when they arrive and immediately points out the problem. Paladins have technology that can track the residual scars left behind by teleportation, and given enough time, they can build an artificial gateway straight to a jumper's location. Back at Millie's apartment, Roland and his men are already doing exactly that. While David and Millie wait out the portal's stabilization in the desert base, David digs through Griffin's files and makes a shocking discovery: information about his own mother. Mary is a paladin. Before he can process it, the portal opens. Roland and his men emerge and attack. David is quickly snared by Roland's electrified cables and left helpless, and Roland prepares to finish him off, but Griffin intervenes at the last second, armed with a flamethrower, forcing Roland to retreat. The battle escalates fast. To counter Roland's equipment, Griffin teleports into a nearby city, grabs an entire bus, and hauls it back to the hideout, crashing it directly onto Roland, who still survives the impact. Griffin unleashes another blast from the flamethrower, driving Roland back through the still open portal, then follows him through, continuing the fight at Millie's apartment. Meanwhile, Millie cuts through the cables to free David. Before they leave, she makes him promise that once he takes her home, he'll stay out of her life forever. David reluctantly agrees, and in the same moment finally admits a truth he's carried for years, since childhood. Millie has been the only person he's ever truly loved. The emotional moment is cut short when Griffin suddenly returns, having stolen the Paladin's portal machine, proudly announcing they no longer need to worry about being tracked. But Roland has one last trick. Using the residual scar left by Griffin's return jump, he launches a grappling hook through the closing gateway, catching Millie and dragging her through just before the portal seals shut. In an instant, she's gone. David wants to rescue her immediately, but Griffin has a different plan. He starts assembling a powerful explosive device, intending to teleport it into the apartment, wipe out every paladin inside, and end the threat for good. Millie's survival means nothing to him. David refuses to sacrifice her. Before Griffin can stop him, David grabs the bomb and teleports away, dropping it harmlessly inside the Colosseum. Enraged, Griffin pursues him, and the argument turns into a fight as both men struggle over the detonator while teleporting across the globe, jumping from location to location in rapid succession. At one point they land atop the Empire State Building. Seeing an opening, David throws the detonator away, forcing both of them to chase after it, and the pursuit continues through a string of increasingly dangerous jumps. At one point they arrive in the middle of an active battlefield in Chechnya. Ignoring the chaos around them, Griffin teleports a truck directly into David's path to try to stop him, but David keeps fighting. Griffin eventually recovers the detonator, but before he can use it, David tackles him and slams him against a high-voltage power structure. The intense electrical current traps Griffin long enough to take him out of the fight. With no time to lose, David teleports back to Millie's apartment, where he finds her bound to a wall. The moment he tries to free her, Roland attacks with his electrified baton, subduing and capturing David as well. For a moment it looks like the end. Roland prepares to execute him. Then Millie speaks. She apologizes for doubting him and admits she finally understands what's been happening. Her words give David the emotional strength he needs, and something inside him shifts. Suddenly, an incredible surge of power erupts. Instead of teleporting himself, David teleports the entire room. In a flash, the section of the apartment containing everyone vanishes from the building and reappears submerged in the waters of the Heron River. The unexpected move disorients everyone. Underwater, David struggles to stay conscious, but Millie reaches him and helps him focus, giving him enough clarity to teleport again. Together they escape to the old library where his powers first appeared years ago. Millie revives him with a sharp slap across the face. As David comes back to his senses, he realizes Roland survived the ordeal and is still nearby. After moving Millie to safety, David confronts Roland one last time, and this time, he controls the fight. Grabbing Roland, he teleports them both to a remote cave hidden within the Grand Canyon, isolated, hard to escape, and far from anyone Roland could harm. Before leaving, David reminds him that this is mercy. If he wanted revenge, he could have left Roland somewhere far worse. Then he teleports away. Several days later, David follows a lead from Griffin's files about his mother, which takes him to a snowy, remote region where Mary has built an entirely new life. There he discovers something unexpected. Mary now has another daughter and a family of her own. When confronted, she finally tells him the truth. She left years ago because she knew what he was becoming. As a paladin, she understood the danger his powers would attract. Despite everything, she insists she loves him. But she can't abandon the paladins either. The conflict between them remains unresolved. Mother and son share an emotional embrace, and Mary admits the only gift she can offer is a warning and a little extra time before the organization catches up to him again. David finally accepts the painful reality that his mother stands on the opposite side of this war, and with nothing left to say, he walks away. Later, he reunites with Millie, and the two leave the cold behind, departing together for somewhere warmer, ready to start a new chapter after everything they've been through. So, I finally sat down and rewatched Jumper, and honestly, this is one of those movies that's kind of fascinating to talk about, because people's reactions to it are all over the map. Some viewers tear it apart, others have a real soft spot for it. Having revisited it, I can see where both sides are coming from. The strange thing about Jumper is that it doesn't take long to understand why it caught people's attention in the first place. The moment you hear the basic premise, a guy who can instantly teleport anywhere in the world, your brain starts filling in the possibilities. You imagine what you'd do with the power, where you'd go, what rules you'd break, how different life would be if distance simply stopped mattering. That's a powerful hook, and for a while the movie rides it surprisingly well. There's real fun in watching someone suddenly gain access to a world without limitations and no airports, no waiting, no borders, just a thought and you're somewhere else. But even in that opening stretch, you can feel the film balancing on a thin line. Two different versions of the movie seem to be fighting each other. One wants to be a bigger science fiction story full of mystery, hidden history, and larger questions about these jumpers. The other is perfectly happy being a fast-moving action adventure built around cool visuals and globe-trotting spectacle. That tension never really goes away. What makes Jumper interesting isn't that it's a disaster, it isn't. There are plenty of genuinely entertaining moments. The problem is that the concept is so immediately exciting that you keep imagining possibilities bigger than what actually ends up on screen. That's the feeling I kept returning to while watching it, and not boredom, not frustration, more like curiosity mixed with missed potential. Every time the movie introduces a new idea, a new location, or a new piece of its world, you lean forward expecting it to go somewhere really interesting. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but the expectation is always there. Maybe that's why Jumper has stayed such a divisive movie over the years. People don't argue about it because nothing works, they argue about it because they can clearly see something that could have worked even better. That's what makes it worth discussing, not a hidden masterpiece, not a total failure, but a film sitting in that strange middle ground where the premise is often more memorable than the movie itself. And honestly, that's where some of the most interesting conversations happen. The thing is, Jumper doesn't really sell itself on its characters at first, and it doesn't sell itself on the story either. It sells itself on a question, a simple one: what if you could go anywhere? Not tomorrow, not after booking a ticket, not after sitting through security checks and delayed flights. Right now. One second you're standing in your bedroom, the next you're looking at the pyramids. Maybe you're having lunch in Tokyo, watching the sunset in Rome, and somehow still making it home before anyone notices you're gone. That's the fantasy the movie is built around, and honestly, it's a pretty great one. The moment David discovers he can teleport, the film taps into something almost everyone has imagined at some point, maybe not teleportation specifically, but the idea of total freedom. No distance, no barriers, no limits. To its credit, the movie understands that appeal right away. A lot of superhero films spend their early scenes convincing you that powers are a burden, something dangerous, something to fear. Jumper goes the opposite direction. At least for a while, having this ability looks incredible. David isn't saving the world, protecting innocent people, or trying to become some larger-than-life hero. He's basically doing what a lot of people secretly think they'd do if nobody could stop them: travel everywhere, see everything, take shortcuts, live comfortably, break a few rules, maybe more than a few. That's actually one of the more interesting things about the premise. The movie doesn't treat teleportation as an immediate responsibility, it treats it like temptation. What happens when someone gets a power this extraordinary but doesn't necessarily become a better person because of it? That's a messier and probably more realistic question. If we're honest with ourselves, most people wouldn't spend their first week with teleportation solving global problems. We'd be visiting places we've always wanted to see, showing off, avoiding traffic, and making some very questionable decisions along the way. The film understands that side of human nature surprisingly well, at least in theory. The other thing I found interesting is how naturally the power lends itself to action. Teleportation isn't just a cool visual gimmick here, it changes how people move, fight, escape, and survive. Even before the movie fully explores those possibilities, you can feel the potential sitting there. Every scene carries the sense that almost anything could happen, because geography no longer matters. A locked room doesn't matter, a prison doesn't matter, distance doesn't matter. The whole world becomes part of the playground. That's what makes the concept so strong, and probably why people still talk about Jumper years later despite its flaws. The premise sticks with you. It's one of those ideas that instantly fires up your imagination. The funny thing is, while watching the movie, I kept drifting into daydream mode, not because I was losing interest, but because I was thinking about all the possibilities. What would I do with that power? What rules would I set for myself? Would I actually use it responsibly, or end up making the same mistakes David does? That's the sign of a genuinely compelling concept. It keeps working even when the movie isn't actively explaining it. In many ways, that's both Jumper's greatest strength and its biggest challenge. The central idea is so naturally exciting that it constantly raises expectations. Every new scene feels like it could open a door into something fascinating. Sometimes it does, sometimes it only scratches the surface, but that core concept never stops being interesting. Even when the movie stumbles, the fantasy of jumping anywhere in the world remains just as appealing as it was in the opening minutes. That's probably why the film still has fans today, not because the execution is flawless, but because the fantasy itself is incredibly easy to buy into. Once the movie moves past the initial thrill of teleportation, it starts building the actual story around David Rice. And this is where things get more complicated. David isn't introduced living a great life, quite the opposite. He's a lonely kid in a difficult home, dealing with an emotionally distant father who has his own struggles, plus the lingering absence of a mother who left years earlier and left behind questions that never stopped following him. The film doesn't dwell on these details for long, but they matter because they shape who David becomes. When he first discovers his ability, it isn't in some grand heroic moment, it's an accident, a desperate situation, the kind of moment where survival instinct kicks in before understanding does. I like that approach. The movie doesn't waste much time turning teleportation into a complicated scientific mystery. David discovers something impossible has happened and, like most teenagers probably would, spends more time figuring out how to use it than questioning why it exists. That feels pretty believable. What follows is less an origin story in the traditional superhero sense and more an escape story. David finds a way out of his town, his family problems, the life he doesn't want. For a while, that's exactly what the movie becomes, a fantasy about leaving everything behind. Interestingly, David doesn't really view his power as a responsibility, he views it as freedom. That's a small distinction, but it changes the whole direction of the story. Most movies built around extraordinary abilities eventually push their characters toward some greater purpose. Jumper takes a different route. David gets a gift that could completely transform his life, and his first instinct is basically to build the life he's always wanted. There's something oddly refreshing about that, even if it's morally questionable. Of course, the story can't stay in that fantasy forever. Eventually the film introduces the larger conflict, and the Foundation starts expanding beyond David's personal journey. We hear about other people with similar abilities and learn David isn't unique and, more importantly, that people are actively hunting individuals like him. That's the moment the movie shifts gears. What started as a story about escape suddenly becomes a story about survival. The problem is that the transition happens so fast it almost feels like the movie is racing to reach the next stage of the plot. There are several moments where I wanted to linger a little longer, not because the pacing is slow, it isn't, but because some of the most interesting parts of David's life get treated like brief stopovers before the next action sequence. His adjustment to his powers, his emotional reaction to leaving home, the consequences of building a whole new life, those ideas are there, but the movie rarely pauses long enough to fully unpack them. That pattern starts showing up early. Jumper constantly introduces fascinating pieces of its story, a family drama, hidden abilities, secret organizations, unanswered mysteries, yet it often seems more interested in moving forward than digging deeper. To be fair, that fast pace keeps the film from feeling sluggish. There's always something happening, new locations, new threats, new discoveries, but it also creates this strange feeling that the story is always one step ahead of itself. You're constantly catching up. Looking back, I think the setup does enough to get the movie moving. It establishes David, lays out the rules of his world, and creates a conflict large enough to carry the rest of the narrative. The issue isn't that the foundation is weak, it's that the foundation feels bigger than the house eventually built on top of it. You can see all these intriguing directions the story could take, and that sense of possibility follows the movie almost the entire way through. Sometimes that's exciting, other times it's a little frustrating. Either way, it's hard not to notice. One reason Jumper can be so frustrating is that the world it introduces is actually pretty interesting, and the movie keeps opening doors. It just rarely walks through them. As the story unfolds, we learn David isn't the only person who can teleport. There are others scattered around the world who've had this gift long before he discovered it. Then we learn there's an entire group dedicated to hunting them down. Immediately my brain started firing off questions. Who are these people? How long have they existed? Where do these powers come from? Why are they being hunted? How many jumpers are actually out there? You can feel the movie teasing bigger answers just around the corner, but that's kind of where the strange relationship between Jumper and its own mythology begins. It introduces mysteries much faster than it resolves them. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing on its own. Leaving details unexplained can make a world feel bigger. And some of the best science fiction gives you just enough to spark your imagination and trusts you to fill in the blanks. The issue is that Jumper occasionally feels less mysterious and more incomplete. There's a difference. Mystery creates curiosity, missing information creates confusion, and the film drifts between those two states throughout most of its runtime. Take the Jumpers themselves. They're treated almost like a hidden species living alongside normal society, and their ability to appear anywhere on Earth instantly should completely reshape how they experience the world. Yet we learn surprisingly little about their lives beyond the basic mechanics of teleportation. Do they have rules, communities, families connected by this ability? Are there hundreds of them? Thousands? The movie never seems particularly interested in exploring that. Then there are the Paladins. On paper, they're a fascinating idea, a secret organization that's apparently been hunting Jumpers for generations. People who see these abilities as dangerous, unnatural, even sinful. That's a strong setup, but again, the film mostly stays on the surface. You hear references to history and long-standing conflict, hints that this war stretches back much further than David realizes, and honestly, those hints were often more intriguing than the answers we actually got. The deeper the movie gets into this conflict, the more it feels like we've arrived in the middle of a much larger story that's already been going on for years. Sometimes that's exciting, other times it's frustrating, because you keep waiting for the movie to explain itself. Even the Paladins' technology raises questions. They have methods for tracking Jumpers, fighting them, disrupting their abilities. Cool, visually interesting ideas, but where did it come from? Who developed it? Who funds it? How does this secret war continue without attracting outside attention? Fascinating questions, mostly unanswered. What's funny is that despite all these gaps, I never fully lost interest in the mythology. If anything, the opposite happened. The less the film explained, the more I found myself imagining what a deeper version of this world might look like. That's probably the biggest compliment I can give the world building. It made me want more, not because everything on screen was fully realized, but because the foundation felt like it had enormous potential. You can picture an expanded universe with entire stories beyond David's perspective. The other Jumpers, different factions, different philosophies about these powers, generations of hidden history. The movie occasionally brushes against those possibilities, and whenever it does, it becomes genuinely intriguing. The frustrating part is that it never stays there long, treating its mythology more like background decoration than a major storytelling focus. It's present, it's important, it clearly matters to the larger world, yet the film seems more interested in moving on to the next chase scene than unpacking what any of it means. Maybe that's why so many people walk away from Jumper feeling like they've only seen the first chapter of a much bigger story. The world itself isn't the problem. If anything, it might be one of the movie's strongest ideas. It's just a world that often feels bigger than the film exploring it. Now let's talk about David Rice, because how you feel about Jumper is probably going to depend a lot on how much you connect with him, and that's where things get complicated. David is an unusual protagonist for a movie like this, not because he has teleportation powers. We've seen extraordinary abilities before, superheroes, mutants, chosen ones, secret agents, but because of how little interest he shows in being anything more than a regular guy who got lucky, or maybe unlucky, depending on how you look at it. The moment he realizes what he can do, his priorities become pretty clear. He's not trying to help people understand the larger meaning of his powers, or even particularly curious where they came from. He just wants a better life. In some ways, that's refreshing. For years, we've been conditioned to expect the same arc from these stories. Someone gains incredible power, struggles with responsibility, learns important lessons, becomes a hero. David skips several chapters of that playbook almost immediately. He discovers he can teleport and basically thinks, well, this changes everything. Then starts building the life he always wanted. It's selfish, reckless, morally questionable, but weirdly, it also feels human. I think that's what makes him such a divisive character. Some viewers hate him because he rarely makes the kind of choices we're trained to admire in protagonists. Others find him more believable precisely because he isn't pretending to be some noble savior. He's flawed in a very specific way. The problem is the film doesn't always know what it wants us to feel about those flaws. Sometimes it seems like we're supposed to admire his freedom, other times criticize his selfishness, and occasionally it wants both reactions at once. Because of that, David can be surprisingly hard to connect with emotionally. There are several moments where the film presents opportunities for growth, situations that could challenge his worldview. Moments where he might start seeing his abilities differently, but more often than not, he stays roughly the same person even as the circumstances, danger, and stakes around him change. When I think back on memorable science fiction or superhero stories, I usually remember the character's journey first. The powers are cool, but it's the transformation that sticks with me. With David, I often found myself remembering the teleportation more than the person doing it. That's not necessarily because he's badly written, it's more that the concept surrounding him is so much bigger than he is. The power steals the spotlight, the world steals the spotlight, and even some supporting characters occasionally steal the spotlight. There were moments where I was more interested in other people in this universe than in following David himself. Not exactly the reaction you want for your lead character. That said, David isn't completely without depth. Underneath the confidence and impulsiveness, there's still a kid carrying abandonment issues, unresolved family trauma, and a deep desire to escape the life he came from. The movie touches on those ideas enough for you to understand where some of his behavior comes from. It just doesn't always dig as deeply as it could. That's really the story of David Rice as a character. Not a traditional hero, not quite an anti-hero either. Somewhere in between, a young man handed an unbelievable gift before he had the maturity to know what to do with it. Sometimes that makes him frustrating, sometimes interesting, sometimes both within the same scene. By the end, I wasn't attached to David the way I am to the best protagonists in the genre, but I was interested in him. I understood him even when I disagreed with almost every decision he made. There were moments where I found myself thinking the movie wasn't really about a hero learning responsibility at all. It was about someone spending most of the story trying to avoid it. That's a riskier character choice, and whether it works will probably depend on the viewer, but it definitely makes David Rice a more unusual lead than he first appears. One thing I kept noticing while watching Jumper is that some of the most interesting people in the movie aren't the main character, and that's both a compliment and a problem. Let's start with Griffin. Honestly, every time Jamie Bell showed up, the movie got a little more alive. Griffin feels like someone who's already lived through an entire story before this movie even started. They experienced angry, carrying scars from the hidden war between Jumpers and Paladins. Unlike David, who's still figuring things out, Griffin already understands the dangers that come with these abilities. There's an energy to him that instantly grabs your attention, and you get the sense he's seen things David hasn't, made mistakes David hasn't made yet, lost people David hasn't lost yet. Because of that, he often feels like he's carrying a much larger story just outside the frame. There were multiple moments where I wanted the movie to follow Griffin instead, not because David disappears as a character, but because Griffin arrives with a sense of history and purpose that's instantly compelling. The frustrating part is the movie never fully explores him. It gives you enough to make you curious, then moves on, which, honestly, becomes a recurring theme throughout Jumper. Then there's Millie. She's one of those characters who feels important to the story but not always important to the plot. She's clearly meant to represent something bigger for David, a connection to his past, a reminder of the life he left behind, maybe even the possibility of a normal future. The problem is she often feels more like an idea than a fully developed person. A lot of the romance depends on us simply accepting that David has carried these feelings for years. And while that's understandable, I never felt the movie spent enough time building their relationship into something truly memorable. It's not bad, it's just there. The romance functions, moving the story forward when needed, but I rarely felt emotionally invested in it. There are scenes where you can see what the filmmakers were going for, but the chemistry never quite carries them to the finish line, and because of that, Millie sometimes feels like a passenger in a story constantly rushing toward its next action sequence. Then there are David's parents, probably the biggest example of untapped potential in the entire film. His father is introduced as a major influence on his life, and their relationship, at least in theory, shapes the emotional baggage David carries into adulthood. But once the larger plot kicks in, that storyline gradually fades into the background. The same happens with his mother. When she enters the story, it feels like we're finally about to get some major answers. Years of unresolved questions hang over David's life, and for a moment it seems like the movie is preparing to explore them. Then it doesn't go quite as far as you'd expect. Not because those scenes are bad, they're actually some of the more intriguing character moments in the film. They just arrive so late, and get so little attention, that they end up feeling smaller than they should. It's almost as if the film introduces entire emotional storylines right as it's running out of time to develop them, which is a shame, because those family dynamics could have added a lot more depth to David's journey. What's interesting is that almost every supporting character in Jumper feels connected to a larger story we're only seeing pieces of. Griffin feels like he deserves more screen time. Millie feels like she needed more development. David's parents feel like they needed more exploration. Even some of the smaller characters leave behind unanswered questions. And while that occasionally makes the movie feel incomplete, it also keeps the supporting cast from being forgettable. They're not boring. If anything, the opposite is true. Many of them are interesting enough that you wish the movie would stop moving for a few minutes and let them breathe. By the end, I wouldn't say Jumper has an amazing supporting cast in terms of development, but it does have a cast full of characters who hint at deeper stories than the film ever fully tells, and sometimes that's almost more frustrating than having weak characters, because you can clearly see the potential sitting right there. Now let's talk about the people hunting the Jumpers, because this is where the movie introduces what should have been one of its most fascinating ideas: the Paladins. On paper, they're a great concept, a secret organization that's been tracking and killing Jumpers for generations, not because they're criminals or trying to take over the world, but simply because they believe nobody should have that kind of power. There's something immediately intriguing about that. The moment the film reveals David isn't just being chased by random government agents or generic bad guys, the story suddenly feels bigger. It hints at history, tradition, a conflict going back long before David was even born. For a brief moment I thought, okay, now we're getting somewhere, because whenever a movie introduces two opposing groups with a long shared history, I automatically want to know more. Who started this war? What happened between them? Are the Paladins right about some things? Are the Jumpers completely innocent? There's a lot of potential moral complexity hiding in that premise. Unfortunately, Jumper never digs as deep as I wanted it to. The Paladins remain mysterious throughout most of the movie, but not always in a satisfying way. Sometimes it feels less like the story is carefully preserving secrets and more like it's simply skipping explanations. We learn what they do, we learn what they believe, but rarely why they believe it. That becomes especially noticeable once Roland enters the picture. Samuel L. Jackson's Roland is one of those villains who instantly announces his presence. The white hair, the intense stare, the confidence. Even standing still, he feels like someone who's walked into the movie specifically to make life difficult for everyone around him. Jackson does what Jackson usually does. He brings energy, and even when the script isn't giving him much to work with, he knows how to make a scene feel bigger. The funny thing is Roland sometimes ends up more interesting than the explanations behind him. He talks about Jumpers as dangerous, corrupting, unnatural. He clearly sees himself as the hero of his own story, which I appreciated. Since the best antagonists usually don't wake up thinking they're villains, they think they're solving a problem. Roland definitely believes he's solving one. The issue is the movie doesn't spend enough time challenging or exploring his perspective. Imagine if we'd learned more about previous Jumpers, seen examples of these powers being abused on a larger scale, or if the film had really forced us to question whether the Paladins had a point that could have created some genuinely interesting tension. Instead, Roland mostly functions as a force of pursuit rather than a fully developed ideological opponent. He's there to keep the story moving, to create danger, to give David someone to run from, and to be fair, he does all of that effectively, but I kept feeling like there was another layer missing. Some of the movie's biggest unanswered questions are tied directly to the Paladins. How large is this organization? How long have they existed? How do they operate in complete secrecy? How did they develop technology specifically designed to fight jumpers? The film throws these ideas at you and then sprints toward the next action scene, and eventually you just accept you're probably not getting all the answers. The relationship between jumpers and Paladins almost feels like the middle chapter of a much longer story. The history, the mythology, the conflict are all there, but most of it stays just out of reach. Honestly, that's probably why so many viewers walk away wanting more information about the Paladins than the movie provides, because beneath all the chase scenes and teleportation battles, there's a genuinely compelling conflict underneath. A centuries-old war between two groups with completely different views of power. One side sees it as a gift, the other as a threat. That's a strong foundation for a story. A Jumper just never explores it as deeply as it could have. So while Roland ends up being a memorable presence and the Paladins serve their purpose as antagonists, I couldn't shake the feeling they were carrying a much richer backstory than the film ever shows us. In a movie full of unrealized possibilities, that might be one of the biggest. When it comes to the performances in Jumper, this is probably the area where opinions are most divided, and honestly, after watching the film, I get why. Let's start with Hayden Christensen, because whether you like the movie or not, everything ultimately revolves around him. Hayden has always been one of those actors who sparks debate, as some people never warmed up to him after Star Wars. Others think he's been unfairly criticized for years. Watching Jumper, I landed somewhere in the middle. I don't think he's terrible here, but I also don't think he's carrying the movie the way a role like this probably needed. His performance fits David's personality in a lot of ways: emotionally closed off, detached, impulsive, hard to read, and Hayden captures that side of the character fairly well. The challenge is that those same qualities can make the character feel distant from the audience. There were scenes where I understood what David was thinking but wasn't necessarily feeling it with him. A subtle difference, but one that matters, especially in a movie where we're following this one person for almost the entire runtime. At times Hayden works, other times it feels like the film is asking him to create emotional weight that just isn't there on the page. Is that the performance, the writing, or the character itself? Probably some combination of all three. Then there's Rachel Bilson as Millie, and this is where I kept wishing the movie had given her more to do. It's not that she's bad, it's that the character spends large portions of the story reacting to events rather than driving them. A lot of the emotional investment in the relationship depends on the chemistry between David and Millie, and for me that chemistry was inconsistent. There are moments where it works, where you can feel the history between them, but also scenes where it feels like the movie is telling us about their connection rather than letting us experience it naturally. As a result, Millie never quite becomes as memorable as the film wants her to be. Samuel L. Jackson is an entirely different story, because Jackson has this rare ability to walk into a scene and instantly make it more watchable, even when the character isn't especially complex, even when the script isn't giving him much depth. He just has presence. The moment Roland appears, you pay attention. Part of that's the character design, part of it's the attitude, but a large part is simply Jackson being Jackson. That said, I do think the movie leans on his charisma a bit too much. There were several points where I wanted more insight into Roland as a person, not just as a threat. Jackson does his job, the script just doesn't always meet him halfway. The real surprise of the movie, for me and apparently for a lot of viewers over the years, is Jamie Bell. Every time Griffin shows up, the energy shifts immediately. He brings urgency to scenes that need urgency, personality to conversations that might otherwise feel flat, and most importantly, He feels like someone who's lived in this world much longer than everyone else. There's a confidence to the performance that stands out, not because he's trying harder than everyone else, but because Griffin feels like he genuinely belongs in the story. I kept wanting more scenes with him, more backstory, more involvement in the central plot, and whenever a supporting character generates that reaction, it's usually a sign the actor is doing something right. Then there are the smaller performances. Diane Lane and Michael Rooker are both solid actors, and you can feel flashes of what they could have brought to the story, but neither character gets enough screen time to leave a major mark. It's almost frustrating, because every time one of them appears, it feels like the movie's about to explore something deeper, and then it moves on. Even the younger versions of David and Millie leave a surprisingly strong impression during the early sections of the film, with an emotional sincerity that helps establish the story's foundation before the globe-trotting adventure fully takes over. Looking at the cast as a whole, I don't think Jumper suffers from a lack of talent, far from it. The cast is actually pretty strong on paper. The issue is the screenplay doesn't always know how to make the most of it. Some characters need more depth. Some relationships need more development. Some performances are fighting against material that's thinner than it should be. Because of that, the acting ends up feeling a lot like the movie itself, flashes of something really compelling, moments that work, characters that stand out, but also a lingering sense that several of these actors could have delivered even more with richer material. That's probably the story of Jumper in general. A lot of potential, a lot of capable people, and just enough missed opportunities to leave you wondering what a stronger version of the movie might have looked like. What's interesting about Jumper is that for a movie often criticized for not going deep enough, there are actually quite a few ideas floating beneath the surface, and the film just doesn't always stop long enough to explore them. The biggest one, obviously, is freedom. Not the inspirational poster version of freedom, I mean absolute freedom, the kind most people never experience. Think about it. No schedules, no borders, no traffic, no airports, no waiting, no limitations from distance. If David wants to be somewhere, he's there. That's it. I think that's why the premise is so instantly appealing, and the movie taps into a fantasy much bigger than teleportation itself. The fantasy of removing obstacles from your life. Every inconvenience disappears. Every journey becomes effortless. Every destination becomes available. For a lot of people, that's probably more attractive than the superpower itself. But the film also quietly asks an interesting question. What happens when someone gains complete freedom before they've learned responsibility? Because that's really David's situation. He's handed a power that could completely change the world around him, and his first instinct isn't to help people or become some larger-than-life hero. He uses it for himself. That idea kept resurfacing throughout the movie, not because the film keeps pointing at it, but because it's impossible to ignore. David spends most of the story treating his gift as an escape route from his family, from consequences, from responsibility, from ordinary life. That's what makes him different from a lot of traditional protagonists. Most hero stories are about someone accepting responsibility. David spends much of Jumper doing the opposite, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. There's also an underlying theme of isolation that I don't think the movie fully realizes it has. David's ability separates him from everyone around him. Nobody understands what he can do. Nobody lives the way he lives. Nobody experiences the world the way he does. At first that feels empowering. Eventually it starts feeling lonely. The movie touches on that feeling without making it a central focus, but it's there if you're paying attention. Especially once other Jumpers enter the story. For the first time, David meets people who understand his life, and suddenly the world feels a little less empty. Another idea that kept surfacing is privilege. I don't think the movie set out to explore privilege in a deep or political way, but it's hard not to notice David has access to something nobody else has, an advantage beyond anything a normal person could imagine, and instead of asking how he should use it, he mostly asks how much he can benefit from it. That's not necessarily unrealistic, and it's probably why some viewers find him frustrating. The movie isn't showing us the ideal version of a person with power. It's showing a flawed, selfish version, a one that looks a lot more human than heroic. Then there's the conflict between jumpers and paladins, which introduces another theme that's never fully developed but remains interesting: the fear of difference. The idea that people will always be suspicious of what they don't understand. The paladins don't see jumpers as individuals, they see them as a threat, something unnatural and dangerous. The film never dives deeply into that conflict, but you can see the foundation of a much larger discussion sitting underneath it. If you asked me whether Jumper is a deeply thematic movie, I'd probably say no, not really. But if you asked whether it contains the ingredients for one, absolutely. They're everywhere: freedom, power, isolation, escapism, responsibility, fear, identity. The movie keeps brushing against these ideas, sometimes intentionally, sometimes seemingly by accident. That's part of what makes it such an interesting film to talk about years later, because even when the storytelling doesn't fully explore these themes, the concept itself naturally raises them. Maybe that's the most fascinating thing about Jumper. The movie occasionally seems less interested in its own ideas than the audience is. You'll find yourself thinking about the implications of these powers, David's choices, and the world around him long after the film has moved on. Not because the movie forces you to, but because the premise quietly invites you to. Some of the most memorable science fiction concepts do exactly that. Now, somewhere in the middle of all the teleportation, secret wars, globe-hopping adventures, and unanswered mysteries, Jumper also tries to tell a love story, and honestly, this is one of the more mixed parts of the movie for me. Not because the romance is terrible, but because it's surprisingly ordinary, which feels strange to say about a film where people can teleport across continents. The relationship between David and Millie is built around a familiar idea. She's the girl he's never really forgotten, connected to a time in his life before everything changed, before the powers, the money, the impossible lifestyle. In theory, that works really well on paper. There's something naturally relatable about reconnecting with someone who represents a piece of your past, a reminder of who you were before life got complicated. The movie clearly wants Millie to be that grounding force, a connection to humanity, a reminder that David's life isn't entirely built around teleportation and running from danger. The problem is the relationship never quite reaches the emotional level the film seems to be aiming for. Part of that comes down to pacing. Jumper moves fast, really fast. One moment David is rediscovering Millie, and the next they're traveling across the world together. The relationship develops at the same speed as the movie itself, so certain emotional beats arrive before they've had room to grow. I never found myself rooting against them, but I also wasn't fully invested in where things were heading. It mostly existed in the background, which is kind of the recurring issue. The movie keeps presenting the romance as important, yet it rarely stays the focus long enough to truly land. There are moments where you can see what the filmmakers were going for: a guy who spent years escaping his past finally reconnecting with someone from it, someone who's lived most of his life alone trying to build a genuine connection. Solid ideas, but they keep getting interrupted by the bigger story, the next chase, the next discovery, the next action sequence, the next teleportation set piece, and before you know it, the emotional momentum has shifted elsewhere. What's interesting is that the romance also reveals a lot about David as a character. His relationship with Millie isn't just about love, it's about normalcy. David can travel anywhere in the world and live a life most people could never imagine. Yet the one thing he keeps returning to is someone from home, someone familiar, someone connected to the life he left behind. I actually found that more interesting than the romance itself, and tells us something important about him. For all his freedom, part of him still wants something ordinary, a connection that isn't based on extraordinary abilities. The irony is the movie sometimes seems more interested in that idea than in actually developing the relationship. Because of that, Millie sometimes feels less like a fully realized character and more like a symbol of what David is searching for: stability, comfort, belonging. The relationship isn't without charm, though there are a few quieter moments that work precisely because they aren't trying too hard. Moments where the film simply lets these characters exist together without forcing a dramatic payoff. I wish there'd been more scenes like that, more conversations, more breathing room, but there were also moments where I could feel the movie rushing past opportunities that might have made the experience more meaningful and memorable. That's the trade-off Jumper constantly makes: speed over depth, momentum over reflection, excitement over exploration. Sometimes that's the right call, sometimes it isn't. Funnily enough, if the movie had slowed down too much, some viewers probably would have complained it dragged. Instead it lands on the opposite end of the spectrum, a film almost too eager to reach its next destination, which is fitting, given it's a story about a guy who can instantly travel anywhere in the world. Of course the movie itself struggles to sit still. Jumper is never in danger of losing your attention, and the real question is whether it's willing to spend enough time with its best ideas before jumping to the next one. Sometimes it does, a lot of the time it doesn't. Either way, you're rarely bored. One of the more interesting things about Jumper is that it never seems completely sure what genre it wants to belong to, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It's actually part of what makes the movie a little hard to categorize. If someone asked me to describe Jumper in one sentence, I'd probably pause, because technically it's science fiction, but it doesn't behave like traditional science fiction. It has superpowered characters but doesn't fully commit to being a superhero movie either. There's action, romance, a bit of mystery, a little fantasy, a bit of a coming-of-age story, a bit of a chase thriller. It borrows pieces from several genres and blends them into something recognizable but slightly hard to define. That genre identity plays a huge role in how people respond to the movie, because depending on what you're expecting, Jumper can feel very different. If you're hoping for a deep science fiction story with detailed mythology and complex world building, you might walk away disappointed that the ingredients are there. The movie just doesn't spend enough time developing them. If you're expecting a traditional superhero journey, you might also feel a bit disconnected. David isn't trying to save anyone, isn't becoming a symbol, isn't learning the kind of lessons most superhero protagonists eventually learn. The movie intentionally sidesteps a lot of those genre conventions. But if you're looking for a fast-moving action adventure built around a cool concept, Jumper works a lot better, and I think that's where its strongest appeal really lies. Not as a serious science fiction epic, not as a groundbreaking superhero story, but as a fun, high-concept adventure. The film often feels aimed directly at audiences who grew up imagining impossible abilities. That phase, staring out a classroom window wondering what superpower you'd pick if you had the chance. Flight, invisibility, telekinesis, teleportation. Jumper taps directly into that part of the imagination. A lot of its popularity probably comes from the fact that teleportation is one of those powers that's universally appealing. You don't need a complicated explanation or a detailed backstory. The appeal is immediate, and the movie leans into that fantasy hard. At times it almost feels like wish fulfillment more than science fiction. The world becomes your playground, every destination accessible, every limitation gone. There's something very youthful about that idea. And I don't mean that negatively. Jumper has a distinctly young adult energy running through it from beginning to end. The younger protagonist, the first love storyline, the feeling of escaping your hometown, the fantasy of complete freedom, the rebellion against authority. It's all there. Even the pacing feels youthful, constantly moving forward, constantly introducing something new, rarely slowing down to reflect for long. That's part of its charm, and occasionally part of its weakness. What's fascinating is that if this exact premise had been approached from a darker or more mature angle, it could have become a completely different film: a psychological thriller, a science fiction mystery, a character study, maybe even something closer to a conspiracy story. Instead, Jumper chooses accessibility, excitement, entertainment. Whether that works for you depends largely on what you wanted from the movie in the first place. I can easily imagine two people watching the same film and having completely different reactions. One sees wasted potential, The other sees a fun popcorn movie, and honestly, both viewpoints make sense, because Jumper sits right in the middle of those two experiences. It's ambitious enough to make you think about what it could have been, but accessible enough to simply enjoy on the surface if that's what you're after. That's a strange place for a movie to exist, yet it's exactly where Jumper lives. A not fully science fiction, not fully superhero, not fully action, but borrowing enough from each genre to feel distinct, even years later. That's probably one of the reasons people keep talking about it, not because it perfectly fits into a category, but because it never completely does. Now, this is probably the section where Jumper loses the most people, because even viewers who enjoy the movie usually end up admitting the same thing eventually. The more you think about certain parts of the story, the shakier they become. Honestly, this is one of those films where your enjoyment is directly tied to how willing you are to just go with the flow. If you're the type who likes to sit back and enjoy the ride without overanalyzing every detail, you'll probably have a much better experience. If you're the type who starts asking questions halfway through a scene, Jumper can become a very different movie. What's funny is that many of the logic issues aren't caused by the premise itself. A teleportation isn't the problem. The audience already accepts that impossible things exist in this world. That's part of the deal with science fiction. The trouble comes from everything surrounding the teleportation: the rules, the decisions, the explanations, or sometimes the lack of them. Throughout the movie, characters occasionally behave in ways that feel less like natural decisions and more like the screenplay racing toward its next destination. And once you notice the pattern, it's hard to ignore. There were several moments where I found myself asking simple questions. Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they tell that person earlier? Why is nobody discussing this obvious possibility? Why does this organization operate this way? The film often has answers for immediate plot problems, but not always for the larger questions those solutions create. The Paladins are a perfect example. The more we learn about them, the more questions naturally appear. How large is this organization? How do they function on a global scale? How do they maintain secrecy? How does their technology exist without attracting attention? The movie introduces these ideas confidently but rarely sticks around long enough to fully explain them, so the mythology sometimes feels less like a carefully constructed system and more like a collection of cool concepts. Interesting, but still just concepts. Then there are the rules surrounding the Jumpers themselves. Not the powers exactly, but how those powers interact with the world. The movie occasionally establishes limitations, then introduces situations that make you wonder where those limits actually begin and end. To be fair, almost every science fiction story faces this. At the moment characters get extraordinary abilities, audiences start testing the boundaries, looking for loopholes, alternative solutions, smarter strategies. That's normal. The problem for Jumper is that teleportation is such a powerful ability that viewers naturally spend a lot of time imagining easier ways characters could solve their problems. Sometimes the movie addresses those possibilities, sometimes it just moves on before you can think about them too much. Another weakness tied to the narrative is how often important developments arrive without enough setup. Not because the events themselves are impossible, but because the emotional groundwork isn't always there. A revelation happens, a relationship changes, a major truth comes out, and occasionally the movie treats those moments like checkpoints rather than experiences, acknowledging them and quickly moving on. As a result, some developments feel less impactful than they should. None of these issues completely break the movie, at least not for me. I've seen films where plot holes pile up so much they destroy the whole experience. A Jumper never gets there. Instead, the logic issues operate more like background noise, constantly present, noticeable, but not always loud enough to stop the movie from being entertaining. What they do affect is immersion. Every unanswered question creates a tiny crack. Every unexplained detail adds another. Every forced feeling character decision adds one more. Individually small, collectively harder to ignore. I think that's one reason so many people describe Jumper as frustrating rather than outright bad. Most of the problems feel fixable. You can see the solutions, a few extra scenes, a little more explanation, more development for certain storylines, a bit more patience with the mythology. The foundation is already there, the movie just doesn't spend enough time reinforcing it. Some viewers will never care about any of this, and that's completely fair. The action works, the concept works, the pacing works, and for many people that's enough. But for viewers who get invested in the world, the questions start piling up, and eventually they become part of the viewing experience. By the end of the film, I wasn't thinking this makes no sense. I was thinking something slightly different. I wish this made a little more sense. Because underneath the inconsistencies, the shortcuts, and the occasional leaps in logic, there's still a genuinely compelling idea trying to emerge. That's what makes these weaknesses so noticeable. Not because the movie has nothing going for it, but because it has enough going for it that you want the storytelling to be just a little stronger. Sometimes that's the most frustrating kind of flaw a movie can have. If there's one phrase that kept popping into my head while watching Jumper, it's this: there should be more, not necessarily more action, not necessarily a longer runtime, just more of the world, the mythology, the characters, more of everything the movie keeps hinting at. I think that's why discussions about Jumper have survived for so many years. People don't just talk about the movie itself, they talk about the movie they imagined while watching it. That's a very different thing, because Jumper is filled with ideas that feel larger than the actual story being told. You've got people who can teleport anywhere on Earth, a secret organization hunting them, generations of hidden conflict, unexplored rules, unanswered questions, different perspectives on power. The ingredients for a massive franchise are sitting right there on the table, and the movie knows it. You can feel it. Almost every major revelation seems to suggest a larger world waiting beyond the edges of the screen, and that's where things get both exciting and frustrating. Exciting because the possibilities are genuinely interesting, frustrating because the film rarely explores them. There were multiple moments where I got more curious about the wider universe than the immediate plot. What are other Jumpers doing? How many exist? What do their lives look like? Are there different factions, different philosophies, different ways of using these abilities? The movie occasionally brushes against these questions, then immediately moves on, like being shown the entrance to a fascinating building and told you're only allowed to look through the front window. What's especially interesting is how much Jumper feels like the beginning of something, not the middle, not the end, the beginning. A lot of movies leave room for sequels. Jumper almost feels built around the assumption that future stories are coming. There are character arcs that feel unfinished, world-building threads barely explored, questions that seem intentionally left hanging. The film constantly creates the sensation that we're only seeing the first layer of a much larger universe. Sometimes that can be exciting, as some franchises thrive because the first installment leaves audiences wanting more. The challenge is that wanting more and needing more aren't the same thing. A successful standalone film should still feel complete even if it leaves doors open. With Jumper, there were several moments where it felt less like doors were left open and more like entire rooms hadn't been built yet. That's a subtle distinction, but an important one, and probably the biggest source of the movie's missed opportunity. Reputation. People aren't disappointed because the premise is weak. Nobody watches Jumper and thinks teleportation is boring. Quite the opposite. The premise is so strong it naturally creates bigger expectations. You immediately start imagining stories about other Jumpers, about the Paladins, about the origins of these powers, about the hidden history of this world. The movie sparks those ideas almost effortlessly. The frustrating part is it never fully commits to any of them. What's funny is that watching Jumper today almost feels like watching the pilot episode of a TV series that never got to continue, not because the movie ends on a giant cliffhanger, but because the world feels built for expansion. You can practically see future storylines hiding in the background. Certain supporting characters feel like they have entire adventures of their own. Certain conflicts feel like they're only getting started. Even the mythology feels less like a finished explanation and more like the first chapter of a much larger book. That's probably why some viewers are more forgiving of the movie than others, because even when it disappoints in one area, the potential remains incredibly appealing. Potential can be powerful, sometimes too powerful. In Jumper's case, the possibilities surrounding the movie occasionally become more exciting than the movie itself. That's not an insult, it's actually a compliment in a strange way. The film succeeds at making you care about the world, at making you curious, at making you imagine what else could exist beyond what you're seeing. The problem is that imagination ends up doing some of the heavy lifting the screenplay never quite finishes. By the time the credits roll, I wasn't wishing the movie had been completely different. I was wishing there had been more time, more exploration, more confidence in its own mythology. Because underneath everything are the flaws, the unanswered questions, the uneven execution, there's a genuinely compelling universe trying to emerge. That's what makes Jumper such an interesting case study, not because of what it fully accomplishes, but because of how clearly you can see what it almost became. Sometimes the most memorable missed opportunities are the ones where you can still see the greatness hiding underneath, and Jumper might be one of the clearest examples of that. After spending this much time on what Jumper could have done better, it's only fair to step back and focus on why the movie still has fans nearly 2 decades later. Because despite all the criticism, despite all the talk of missed potential, there are some genuinely strong things working in its favor. Strong enough, in fact, that they're the reason people are still talking about the film at all. The biggest strength is obvious: the concept. I know I've come back to this several times, but it's impossible not to. Teleportation is one of those rare ideas that grabs your imagination instantly, and no long explanation needed, no complicated lore required. The appeal is immediate. The second someone asks, "What if you could go anywhere in the world in an instant?" you are already invested, and Jumper knows that its greatest asset is the fantasy itself. What's impressive is how consistently that fantasy stays appealing from beginning to end. Even when the plot gets messy, even when storylines feel underdeveloped, even when questions go unanswered, the core idea never stops being fun. That's harder to achieve than it sounds. Plenty of movies with great concepts somehow make those concepts feel ordinary. Jumper never really falls into that trap. Teleportation stays exciting every single time. Another major strength is the sense of scale. This movie genuinely feels global, not in the save-the-world blockbuster sense, but literally. You're constantly moving between countries, cities, landmarks, environments. The world feels enormous while still feeling accessible, which is such an important part of the movie's identity. The locations aren't just backgrounds, they're part of the fantasy, part of the appeal, part of the experience. Every new destination reinforces the idea that the whole planet is available to these characters. And I think that's one reason the film stays visually memorable. You don't just remember events, you remember places. Then there are the visual effects. For a movie released in 2008, they hold up surprisingly well, not because they're trying to overwhelm you with spectacle, but because they're focused. The teleportation effects feel clean, distinct, easy to understand, and still satisfying. Every jump has impact, every transition feels meaningful. The visual language of the power is one of the film's smartest creative decisions. The action deserves credit too. I don't think the movie pushes the concept as far as it could have, but even so, the action remains entertaining and the chase sequences work, the teleportation battles work, the momentum works. The film